Our last project will just be a real quickie on rendering a reflected ceiling plan, and this will use a lot of skills that you've already developed using Photoshop for developing your floor plan and rendering your floor plan. And what you'll find is that there are some things you can change in Revit and some that are easier in Photoshop. And like most of the skills that we have learned, it's kind of up to you as to which you find easier. Some people love Revit and want to get the absolute most out of their Revit models, and other people are on less friendly terms with Revit and would prefer to use Photoshop. And I personally find that Revit is kind of hard to bulldoze into getting the graphics you want. So Photoshop is tests my patience a lot less, but I'll leave that up to you. But let's start first by discussing Poche, and we all know about Poche. So first of all, in Revit, you can select the walls in your project. They should all be poche'd, and you can either do it wall type by wall type. So in this project, I've got one wall type. So I'll just go to Edit Type, and then make sure that your coarse scale fill pattern is set to solid fill, and that the color is set to whatever color you want. So if I wanted gray or whatever, I can do it that way. And you just hit apply and OK, and like magic, all of your walls will change. Now it won't do some odd things, like I have a little niche up here. I'm really going to have to fix that in Photoshop. Those are a little too difficult to change. You'll also find that there are other categories of things that you might need to change, like columns and different wall types. If you have a lot of different wall types, which is true for our bigger projects, you're going to want to go to your visibility and graphic overrides and change the poche there. Just find all the objects that you want. And this is like what we did in the floor plan. Find the walls, the columns, there may be furniture, and you should be able to change the settings for the projection lines and the pattern. Also the cut patterns is what we're looking for. Well, what if you like Photoshop and you want to do it in Photoshop? That's fine. You just make sure you get that good quality export. And I think all of you have gotten really good at that. You're going to want to set your view up so that you can print it to a large format PDF file. That's really going to get you the best quality. Just doing file export, as I have mentioned, doesn't always get you the best result. Before you export this, you will probably want to do the line weight adjustments as well. So let's talk about line weights and some of the other graphics that are standard for reflected ceiling plans. And here the biggest things are that obviously the lines for the light fixtures are going to be the things we're most interested in. We can change those kind of one by one. And if you go to the Modify tab, you'll see there is the Favorite Line Work tool. I can click on the Line Work tool, choose Wide Lines, and then I can make the light fixtures have a wider line type. And anything that's a soffit, you're absolutely going to want to do that. Now in this case, you see how it made this line visible where it was blocked by the furnishings before. And that's actually okay. I kind of like that because my soffit goes all the way to this wall. The only thing is, you see how I don't see this line here. I'm going to have to zoom way in to make this line visible of the soffit. There are other line types that you can use, including some of the standard ones that come in Revit. If you want to make, say, a heavy dashed line, that's going to be something that's a little more tricky, but I'm sure you all can do it. First, go to the Manage ribbon, and then under Additional Settings, you're going to go to Line Styles. And this is actually where you can kind of tweak Revit graphics to get some additional settings that you might like to make your drawings look nice. Now, in my case, I actually have a heavyweight line type that I have made. If you don't have one, just make new, and you can call it, Hidden Lights or something like that. Click OK. And over here you can change the line weight, and the line weights are also kind of obscure, but needless to say, like 6 is heavy and 1 is light is basically the idea. You can also change the color of the line weights. You see I have some different colored lines in here. But then the other thing is you're going to want to change what type of line it is. Hidden 1/8 inch seems to show up pretty well on my floor plan, so I'll choose that one. So now when I go to my annotate ribbon and choose detail line, just click on that tool, what you'll see is that I have that line type I created, hidden lights, is now available, and I can draw with it, and with any luck it will show up just like I intended, a heavy dashed line. And this is what you'd want to show when you have a light source that is hidden by other physical objects, in this case a soffit. These lights are mounted over the soffit, which I wouldn't normally see in the reflected ceiling plan. Now, I don't want to have to change every single light fixture because I actually have a lot of them in here. So this is where my friend, the visibility and graphic overrides, comes in again. And I can go to my lighting fixtures layer here and change the line type of the projection. Remember, there's a difference between the cut line type and the projection. Make sure you get the right one. And in this case, I'll just make the line weight 6. And hit apply, and like magic, all of my lights should be nice and dark. Other things you should do to kind of gussy up your reflected ceiling plan are you should look out for imported objects. For example, this is something I got from Revit City, and I don't necessarily want to see this. I want to see the light fixtures above, so I can just hide it. Or I could override the graphics in view by element here, and I can change it so that it has greater transparency. And sometimes this is nice to do because in fact my cut height of the reflected ceiling plan is low enough that I actually should see this in there. I could also just hide it because it's a little confusing, or even better, I could draw in a dashed line representing the fume hood and then hide the overall fume hood. And it's really pretty easy to do that. You should always show things that are kind of above but are made reference to in your plan in this way with sort of dashed lines. True for atrium openings, even stairwells above where maybe you're trying to avoid bumping your head by putting in some wall. It's helpful to know why you're doing that. So anyway, here's my my reflected ceiling plan view of this fume hood where I've just kind of dashed it in, and I might make a note there about what it looks like. In fact, I don't like the graphics of those dashed lines. Maybe I'll make them a little darker back in my line types menu. If you do that, by the way, make sure you haven't used that dashed line somewhere else. This line type was called hidden lines. And so just make sure that you're not going to change it somewhere where you do want them to be green. And the other annoying problem is that sometimes you get these light fixtures which you know make a lot of sense graphically, but sometimes they're kind of like there's just too many lines in there. Once again, I can go to my line work tool, but in this case I can use invisible lines and try to make some of these lines disappear so that the fixture isn't quite so annoying to look at in reflected ceiling plan. And it might take a little bit of double clicking depending on how complicated the fixture is. But you know, a small reflected ceiling plan, all these lines could end up being like kind of a big black blob on my screen. And there you can see I've just kind of left the outline of this object. The other last thing that a lot of you have that drives you crazy is that you don't see your wall sconces. That's because of the cut range involved in a reflected ceiling plan. So if I go in my view properties here, I've just scrolled down to where it says view range. Click edit. And you'll see that there is a cut plane associated with this. I believe normally it's set to 7 feet. I like to set it down at about 5 feet or 5'6". The reason is because this will show light switches, which I like to see, but it will also show wall sconces and door heads, the top of the door, which I really like to see in my reflected ceiling plans. And the reason I like to see these door openings, here's one in my model, is now I know where to put the exit sign if an exit sign is required. If you don't see that reflected, door head in the reflected ceiling plan, it's very difficult to place an exit sign. Another little flourish that people like to add, just another graphical thing, is you can add an underlay of your project. If you choose here, or it says underlay, if you choose the same floor, but where you look down instead of look up, then you will see the furniture in that floor plan below. And in fact, in my project, this casework here is what we're seeing below. Now, I actually don't really want to see that casework, so I think I'm going to leave it off in my project. But I know that for a lot of you, there may be counters or other elements in your project that you wish you could see in your reflected ceiling plan. That's a quick way to do it. A slower way is to just bring it into Photoshop. One other thing that you can do here in Revit is you could label each fixture. Now, your instructors may have a preference during schematic design as to whether or not they want them labeled or they just want them to have a different symbol. If it's a different symbol and you're just going to make a chart for legend, then leave off the letter. I personally don't like using text in Revit because I find it annoying. So I would strongly recommend doing what I'm going to recommend, which is to go and put in your text in either Photoshop or Illustrator or InDesign, wherever you like doing your text. I know a lot of people will compose their final board in InDesign. And if that's true, I would definitely say put in your text there. Some people prefer using Illustrator because it has so many more text options. I certainly do. I would recommend putting the text in there. But wherever it is, be consistent, and that way your final board will have text size that's all the same. Nothing looks more lame than when the text is not the same size. This is also true if your instructors want you to put dimensions or other types of notes in here. Don't use the Revit dimensions and notes. They are obviously very handy because you can come in and do them quite quickly, but they are so difficult to control the text size when you get to your board. Another part of reflected ceiling plans that a lot of instructors like to see is some way of rendering the light fixtures as if they were throwing off light. Wouldn't that be cool? Well, you can actually do that. I have set up here a 3D view of my project. It's the standard 3D view here that we used in our previous project, except I duplicated the view and I called it Reflected Ceiling Plan. You can click on the bottom button so that it makes it orthographic. You can also orient it the same way as your floor plan, but just by dragging the rotator here. And there are little arrows that you can tap on to rotate it one way or another to get it in the orientation you want. As with these other views that we have created, make sure you set your crop region so that it doesn't crop too much and you lose part of your plan, but also that it doesn't crop too little and you end up rendering like half a mile out into the stratosphere there. But then you can render it. I just did a test render here on my computer. And you can see that the rendering is showing some lighting, and it's showing the lighting above the soffit, which is really dramatic, and some of the under cabinet lighting. So it definitely can create an interesting underlay. It's not ideal. Probably I would put the reflected ceiling plan that I exported, just the line work, put it on top of this because it's not really doing what I like. Another type of view which I happen to like is an up view axonometric. It's not a true reflected ceiling plan, but they do actually make some very nice renderings. If you go, let me just call up my up view here, and they can be very interesting, and they're a little more spatial than your reflected ceiling plan, which is kind of flat. Again, not every instructor would like these, and it's probably not a true replacement, but during the design phase, this can actually be quite a dramatic view. So here in Photoshop, first I can see if I really like my rendered layer, which I have placed here in my model. I might want to try to overlay that with my floor plan layer. And what I have, here's the floor plan layer with just the line work and my rendered layer. You will need to mirror the the render view because it's backwards. If you can see here, here's my soffit, but it's on the other side. It's pretty straightforward to do. You just select the layer, and remember when you are selecting, by the way, it's sometimes easier to just select the layer by clicking on it, turning off this auto select. Otherwise, as you're moving the thing around, it tends to select the wrong thing. Drives me crazy. Anyway, just choose the correct layer and choose Edit, Transform, and Flip Horizontal. And there you go, it's mirrored correctly. To get it to be the same size as the floor plan, well, you are just going to have to eye it and just click on one of the grips here. The corner grip will resize it. Don't hold down Shift. See how that distorts it? You don't want to do that. You want to just try and make it the same size as the floor plan. The Commit to Transformation button up here, you won't be able to do anything else until you do that. Another thing that you can do to make your life easier here is put the background layer, the layer which is has the line work on it, put it on top and make the layer blending mode multiply. In fact, either one of these will work, but that just makes it easier to see where those darn lines are. And that's looking pretty good, pretty closely aligned. And you can see the shading on that reflected ceiling pan really gives you a kind of sense of depth. Also, if you have any materials painted up there, any ceiling patterns that have rendered correctly, they will show up just fine. The Poche is a little bit lost, though. Some people like this Poche where it's totally black, where you don't have any objects, although it is a little confusing where the casework is. If you want, you can go and paint the Poche some other color. You can just paint it here using the paint bucket in Photoshop. Note that if you look at the pointer on your arrow, that is where it will select, not on the where the kind of dribble is on the paint bucket. So just click inside that. I have it set to a very low tolerance, so it only gets that gray. And then I have it set to paint contiguous and anti-aliasing and not referencing all layers. So you can see now when I click on my plan, I'll have to come back and make my blending mode normal again, but then I will have to delete this white area. Now it requires using the magic wand, and I'm not going to have contiguous selected because I basically want to get rid of all the white area. Click inside here. It should select all of the white pixels on this layer, and then I can just hit delete and they'll go away. Control D, by the way, deselects everything, and you can get a better sense of how that works. You know, do I like that better? Actually, I think I do like it. I like seeing the walls in there. Now, what about little spots where the Poche just didn't work correctly? To make those fill in, well, you can't do that in Revit. So you basically have to do it here in Photoshop. So make yourself a brand new spanking layer, and then you're going to want to select the area that should be filled in. I'm going to use a rectangular selection tool, but obviously any of the selection tools are going to work. And a little trick is if you have the foreground color already set, just hold down the Alt button and hit the backspace, and it'll fill it with the foreground color. That's just to save you a little time. Obviously, you can use the paint bucket as well. One other thing, little technique that you can use in Photoshop if you don't like your render or you don't like the look of those types of drawings, is you can basically just kind of fill in where it looks like the lighting is glowing. And I have selected these light fixtures where they should be glowing. In this case, these are directional fixtures. I just drew a cone in there. In this case, I drew these kind of circular fixtures. And then make yourself a new layer. And I'm going to just use the Alt backspace button to paint those with the default foreground color. And then I'll go to the layer style, and I'm going to add an outer glow. Here we go. And what you'll see in this outer glow menu, I believe we saw this in the last floor plan lecture, is that you can kind of control the size of these, and you can make them softer or harder depending on the kind of light that you want. And you can also control the opacity. So if you want it to be just kind of a subtle little thing. Now yellow doesn't print well, but it does make it look a lot brighter. So you can see here, I'll just click OK. That kind of makes it look like these light fixtures are glowing. It's not perfect. And you also might want to fiddle around, depending on how you have your layer menu, you might want to fiddle around with the blending mode just to get the optimal look with your other layers that are visible. So for example, if I turn back on the background RCP render, maybe this doesn't look as good with the normal mode. Maybe I'll go with like a soft light, see if that looks nicer. Sometimes a hard light will also look good. It kind of depends on the quality of the render in the background. In this case, if I don't like the background layer, I would definitely recommend adding in some kind of solid color in your reflected ceiling plan. And if you have soffits, I would paint those a slightly different color. Gray is fine. It's very neutral. I know you probably are painting your ceilings white, but gray looks just fine. And that seems to blend well with the yellow as well. So finally, we want to add some text and some kind of legend. Again, as I mentioned, some instructors will want you to label each fixture, probably not during schematics, but they will want each fixture to have a different icon. Now, my personal feeling is Revit is a pain when it comes to changing the way the icons look. You will have to edit the family of different light fixtures if they all have the same look. You can also just draw detail lines on the reflected ceiling plan and then fiddle around with them in Photoshop. But one little trick that I like to use to make a ceiling plan legend is I'll come in and I'll sketch a new ceiling. I'll just draw one off to the side of my floor plan. And then I will copy in the light fixtures that are in my plan, and I can align them very easily. And this assures that I'm going to get exactly the same component, the same kind of graphics that I would have in my ceiling plan. Nothing is more annoying than you have to redraw your legend in PowerPoint or in Photoshop or wherever it is that you have it. And you can see here that I've gotten most of the fixtures in. You do want to align them. It looks sloppy if you don't. So I'll just try to get this vertical part here of one of these other light fixtures and just get the vertical part of this one. These are all round, so it does make them a lot easier to align. But you can make that look nice and neat. This guy is actually just detail lines, so I'm going to have to kind of nudge it. If you need to, by all means, draw in a line that will go through the center of everything to allow you to align them. But the other thing is I also have this light fixture here, which is a linear light fixture above my soffit. I can just click that line and choose Create Similar, and then draw in a section of line. And this is fine for things like under cabinets or wall washers or things that maybe you put in a light fixture, such as a studio light that isn't actually a real light fixture. This is a way that you can kind of say, yeah, I've got something in there. Anyway, once you have this grid, I'm not going to put the text in here. I'm going to bring it into either Photoshop or Illustrator, and I'll put the text in there. Again, you don't need me to show you how to use text, but you do need me to remind you that all the text should be the same size, the same font, the same kind of graphic look to it. And you can see here I've done my legend in Illustrator, and again I like the lines in Illustrator and I like the text options. And what you can do is on your final board you can load in your Photoshop file directly, your reflected ceiling plan Photoshop file directly onto your board in, say, InDesign, and then you can load this legend in separately. And the advantage of that is it just makes it a little more flexible when you go to compose your board. Maybe the legend is not the right size, or maybe you just want it to be in a certain spot on your board. This is mostly flexible. So for my project, I'd like you to just have a reflected ceiling plan legend, and that's it. Just put it on a blank part of a sheet and you're good to go.